What would you do if the pregnant woman your mother had rescued from the roadside turned out to be kneeling in your study at 2 in the morning? Your family's money in her arms, your mother's heirloom diamonds in her shaking hands, and one terrible secret still hidden inside her womb? Only hours earlier, Mrs. Lorry had brought that woman into the villa like an act of mercy, believing she was protecting both a fragile life and an unborn child. By the middle of the night, the same woman would be caught trying to flee into darkness with 500 million dong and the family's most precious jewelry. Trust would shatter, a mother's compassion would turn into rage. Jack would come down the staircase ready to destroy the woman who had betrayed his house, and then, just as judgment prepared to close around her, Tu Tien would speak words capable of tearing open the night itself. The baby in that woman's womb might belong not to scandal, not to greed, but to Jack's dead younger brother. In one breath, theft would become bloodline, punishment would become moral agony, and every person in the room would be forced to ask whether justice is still simple when the criminal may also be carrying the last remnant of your family. That afternoon had begun with mercy. The light over the villa was soft and golden, the kind of expensive quiet that made suffering look temporarily far away. Mrs. Lodi stood near the entrance, supporting a young pregnant woman whose body seemed ready to collapse even while she was still on her feet. The girl introduced herself as Ly. Her face was pale, her lips dry, her movements unsteady from exhaustion. Dust clung to the hem of her clothing. Sweat had dried in thin lines at her temples. She looked like someone life had already used too harshly. Mrs. Lodi's heart gave in immediately. Age had not hardened her. Faith had not made her severe. If anything, both had softened her more. She believed with the full sincerity of an older woman who had seen too much loss that helping another person in distress was not only kindness but duty. She guided Ly into the house with both hands, settled her carefully on a chair, and wiped the sweat from her forehead as though tending to a daughter rather than a stranger. "Stay here and rest, child," she said, her voice trembling with pity. "You and your baby are safe." From the doorway, Jack watched everything in silence. His suspicion did not begin from cruelty. It began from experience. Too many times now, trouble had arrived disguised as weakness. Too many times, those who seemed most helpless had turned out to carry hidden motives. He did not interrupt his mother. He did not dishonor her compassion, but his stillness sharpened. Beside him, Tu Tien also studied the woman quietly. There was kindness in her face, but also caution. A woman who has suffered learns to recognize the difference between ordinary desperation and something harder to read. Ly lowered her head and thanked Mrs. Lordy with watery eyes. Her gratitude sounded convincing enough. Her hands trembled in all the right places. She touched her belly once, almost unconsciously, as if reminding everyone in the room that whatever they might suspect of her, another innocent life was growing inside her and should make them gentler. That detail mattered. Mrs. Lodi asked the housekeeper to prepare a room, hot water, and porridge. Jack said nothing. Tu Tien helped carry in a blanket. The villa, so often strained by hidden worries and quiet family burdens, took on a strange tenderness that evening. It seemed, for a few hours at least, that kindness had interrupted the harshness of the world. But even then, something remained unsettled. Jack caught Tu Tien's gaze once across the hall, and neither needed to explain the look. Both of them felt the same thing. Something about the girl's silence was too measured. Something about the way her eyes moved through the house seemed wrong, not the fearful scanning of a frightened guest, but the quick, invisible counting of someone already memorizing the space. Still, no one acted on suspicion. Mrs. Lodi was in one of her softer moods, and no one wanted to wound that softness. She sat with Ly for a while longer, asking gentle questions, though the girl answered vaguely. She had no stable home. She had nowhere safe to go. She had not eaten properly in days. The baby had made the burden heavier. Every answer was just thin enough to invite pity, and just blurred enough to avoid precision. Tu Tien noticed it, so did Jack, but the night moved forward, and eventually the house settled. Dinner ended, doors closed, footsteps faded. The long villa, which had held so much quiet strain in recent months, finally slipped into the fragile stillness of sleeping hours. Outside, the garden trees barely stirred. Inside, the clocks became louder than the people. Then the night turned. At exactly 2 in the morning, the house was broken open not by a scream, but by intent. Ly opened her eyes in the guest room and sat up slowly. There was no confusion in her movement now. No weakness, no haze of collapse. The pale, helpless woman Mrs. Luddy had brought home no longer existed. In her place was someone colder, more focused, and far more dangerous than anyone in the villa had allowed themselves to believe. She swung her feet to the floor and whispered into the dark, "Forgive me, my child. Your mother needs money. We have to disappear." Whether it was a prayer, an excuse, or a self-blessing for betrayal, even she may not have known. She moved through the corridor like a shadow. The study door was locked, but she had expected that. From her hair she withdrew a simple pin. Her fingers shook, though not from innocence. They shook because theft always forces the body to admit what the mind is trying to justify. She knelt at the drawer and worked the lock with the tense skill of someone who had not learned such things in one desperate night. The lock clicked. Inside lay what she had hoped for and feared might not be there. Bundles of cash, 500 million dong, kept temporarily in the house for a transaction Mrs. Lurie had not yet completed. Beside it, wrapped in silk, lay the diamond jewelry passed down through the family old pieces, brilliant and cold, meaningful not only because of their value, but because they belonged to memory, inheritance, and a line of women who had guarded them carefully. Ly stared for the shortest second. Even greed sometimes pauses before beauty. Then she took everything. She stuffed the money into a large cloth bag, hands trembling harder now. The jewelry followed. Every small sound around her seemed magnified. Her own breath, the rustle of silk, the scrape of wood, the distant ticking of some clock that now felt like accusation. Moonlight entered through the window and cut across the study floor, pale and pitiless. She turned to flee, and the vase shattered. It happened with cruel simplicity. Her foot clipped the pedestal near the doorway. The porcelain vase, one of Mrs. Lurie's treasured pieces, crashed to the floor in an explosion of white shards. The sound ripped through the sleeping house like a blow. Upstairs, doors opened. Mrs. Lurie woke first. Age had made her lighter of sleep, and the sound reached straight into her body with the force of instinct. She came down the hallway in a rush, robe gathered at her chest, her feet unsteady with urgency. When she reached the stair landing and saw movement below, she froze. Ly stood there. One hand gripped the swollen money bag, which bulged through the torn side of her clothing. The other still clutched the silk bundle of diamonds. Broken porcelain glittered at her feet. Her face, white with shock, had not yet arranged itself into a new lie. The old woman's expression changed in 3 terrifying stages. First, confusion, then recognition, then horror. "Child," Mrs. Lodi whispered. But by then, even the word child had already broken inside her. Ly dropped to her knees. Her hands flew to her belly. She cried out in sudden, theatrical pain, twisting her face as if labor itself had begun from terror. It was a desperate instinct, and under other circumstances it might have bought her time. But not now. Not with the money visible, not with the diamonds catching moonlight. Not with the shattered vase at her knees like a witness too obvious to silence. Mrs. Lurie descended the remaining steps trembling. The trust she had offered only hours earlier was now collapsing so violently inside her that even her compassion seemed to recoil. She had opened her house. She had offered food, rest, and protection. She had looked at that pregnant body and seen vulnerability. Now, all at once, she saw calculation, betrayal, and the ugliest kind of answer to kindness. Her hand rose almost before she fully understood that she was raising it. The slap landed across Ly's cheek with the sharp sound of a soul splitting open. "I cared for you and your child," Mrs. Ly cried, her voice breaking. "And you repay me like this?" The housekeeper, now awake and terrified, appeared from the side hall. Mrs. Ly, shaking with rage and pain, ordered her to lock the doors and call the police immediately. The villa, which had seemed full of benevolence only a few hours earlier, now held only shouts, sobbing, broken porcelain, and the sound of an old woman's trust dying in front of her. Jack came down the stairs like judgment. He had heard enough before he saw enough, but once his eyes took in the scene, the bag, the jewelry, his mother in tears, the kneeling girl clutching her cheek, whatever suspicion he had held earlier hardened into something far colder. There was no confusion in him, no need for explanation. His mother's kindness had been made into a weapon against her. That fact alone was enough. He stepped between Mrs. Ly and Ly. "Mother, step aside," he said, his voice icy. "This kind of person doesn't deserve your tears." The cruelty of his calm was more frightening than shouting. He took out his phone and called his personal lawyer first, not the police. That choice revealed exactly what had happened inside him. This was no longer merely a theft. It was a personal violation, a moral insult, a desecration of the one woman he still could not bear to see wounded in old age. He told the lawyer to prepare everything: charges, statements, custody, no softness, no negotiation. Ly looked up at him through tears, and for the first time real fear seemed to disturb her. But Jack did not look like a man who would be moved by fear. Pregnant or not, guilty was guilty. That was where he stood now. Then Tu Tien's voice cut through the room. "Stop!" It did not sound loud. It sounded worse. It sounded like someone speaking from the edge of a truth, too terrible to keep silent. Everyone turned. Tu Tien stood at the foot of the stairs, one hand gripping an old folded paper so tightly it had nearly bent in half. Her face had lost all color. Jack knew that expression. It was the look she wore not when she was merely afraid, but when she was standing before a piece of fate no one else yet understood. "Jack," she said, and her voice trembled. "The baby." Even Jack's anger paused. Tu Tien took another step, then another, as though crossing the room required passing through a storm of her own. Her eyes moved once to Ly, then to Mrs. Ly, then finally to Jack. "It may be Brother Than's child." The entire villa fell silent. Silence did not simply arrive, it crashed. Mrs. Ly's hand, still trembling from the slap, fell uselessly to her side. Jack stared at Tu Tien as if he had not heard the words correctly. The lawyer's voice still murmured faintly from the phone in his hand, meaningless now, distant as another world. Than, his younger brother. Dead, gone. One of the names in the family that no one spoke lightly because grief still lived inside it. Jack's face changed slowly, painfully. Justice had been simple seconds ago. Theft, betrayal, police, charges, prison. Now blood had entered the room, and blood ruins simplicity. Mrs. Ly looked at Ly with a new horror, one not less painful than betrayal but perhaps deeper. Not because it excused her, it did not, but because if Tu Tien was right, if the baby truly belonged to Than, then the woman kneeling there with stolen money and diamonds was also carrying the last remnant of someone the family had already buried. That possibility altered everything and solved nothing. Ly laughed then, but it came out as a tear-broken, unstable sound. She hurled the money bag onto the floor. Bills spilled partly free from the torn opening. The jewelry followed, hitting the marble with hard, expensive little sounds. "You all worship money," she spat, tears streaming down her face. "I only wanted a place for my child. Now tell me, who is the real monster here?" It was not the cry of innocence. It was the cry of someone drowning in grievance so deep that wrongdoing had begun to feel like justice. The police arrived at that exact moment. Blue light flickered briefly across the windows. Heavy steps entered the house. Questions began at once, but no one in the room could answer them the way the officers expected, because the truth no longer fit a neat legal shape. There had been theft, yes. There had been betrayal, yes. But now there was also bloodline, inheritance, the dead younger brother, the unborn child, the possibility that punishment itself might become a second family tragedy. Jack stood in the middle of it all, between his mother and Tu Tien, between the police and Ly, between law and blood. His face no longer carried only anger. It carried torment. If he handed Ly over completely, he might be sending Thon's child into ruin before it was even born. If he protected her blindly, he would be betraying his mother's tears, his house, and the basic truth that kindness had been repaid with theft. Mrs. Lottie looked as if age had suddenly struck her twice. Tu Tien stood frozen, clutching that old paper, already regretting the truth she had been forced to reveal, and yet knowing silence would have been worse. Ly knelt amid cash, diamonds, and broken porcelain, one hand over her belly, defiant and desperate at once. The police moved forward. Metal handcuffs clicked in the officer's hand, cold and final. The night, which had begun with a rescued pregnant woman and an act of mercy, ended in sobs, shattered trust, and the sound of law stepping into a family secret no one was prepared to carry cleanly. And perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. Betrayal is painful, but betrayal mixed with blood is devastating. Because when a stranger steals from you, punishment feels clear. But when the thief may be carrying your dead brother's child, judgment no longer belongs only to justice. It belongs to grief, to memory, to guilt, and to the unbearable question of whether a family can protect its own blood without losing its soul.